Welcome back to ProcessCast with Mark Anderson and Samantha Blake. Your go-to podcast for insights into business process management and the technologies transforming the way we work.
Ever feel like your business is stuck in a bit of a financial rut? Like you're constantly trying to make ends meet, wishing you had more resources to really invest in the future, more to put towards innovation, more to truly grow?
Yeah, that's a pretty common feeling these days. I mean, every business leader I talk to is grappling with this challenge of how to streamline their operations and really free up capital.
Right. So the big question is, how can businesses actually cut operational costs without shooting themselves in the foot,
Yeah.
without sacrificing that long-term potential?
It's a real balancing act, isn't it? And luckily, there's been a lot of great research on this lately. We've got some fantastic insights to dig into from major consulting firms like McKinsey, Deloitte, BCG, and Gartner.
Okay, so this is like our cheat sheet to really understanding the most effective strategies for cost reduction.
Exactly. We're going to break it all down for you. And one of the first things that really jumped out at me, particularly from McKinsey and Deloitte, is this idea that we need to fundamentally shift how we think about cost reduction.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So it's not just about slashing budgets across the board anymore.
Right. The old school approach of just cutting everything equally is actually becoming pretty outdated. And there's good reason for that.
Yeah, I mean, intuitively, it does seem a little bit simplistic, right?
Well, McKinsey actually has some data that backs that up. Their research showed that only about half of executives felt confident that their broad cost-cutting measures actually helped them weather economic storms effectively.
So just making these sweeping cuts might not be the most strategic move.
Exactly. And Deloitte has this great term for it. They call it death by 1,000 cuts. When you just make all these small, indiscriminate cuts across the board, you risk weakening the very things that make your business tick, the things that are essential for future success.
Oh, I see what you mean. You might accidentally cut back on innovation or on those vital customer-facing roles that really drive your revenue.
Exactly. So instead of just blindly cutting costs, the real focus should be on what they call cost optimization.
Okay, so for our listeners out there, what's the key difference between those two approaches? Cost cutting versus cost optimization.
At its core, cost optimization is about being so much more strategic and deliberate with your resources.
Oh, okay, I like that. It's about intentionality.
Right. And Deloitte really emphasizes that this is about freeing up capital for a specific purpose, to invest in those areas that are going to fuel long-term growth and innovation. It's not just about spending less, it's about spending smarter.
That makes a lot of sense. So how do businesses actually make that shift? How do they move from those kind of blunt, across-the-board cuts to this more targeted optimization?
That's where it gets really interesting, because McKinsey highlights the absolute importance of understanding your business's unique value drivers.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it means figuring out what activities truly create value for your customers, what really sets you apart from the competition.
Okay, so you need to know what your core competencies are, what makes you special.
Exactly. And once you have that clear understanding, you can focus your investments on those key areas while very carefully reducing costs in those functions that are less critical to your success.
They actually had a really striking example of this in their report, right? Something about an energy company.
Yeah, they talked about an international energy company that made these deep, across-the-board cuts, and about 6 months later, they were scrambling to find skilled workers in their tech and operations departments.
Because they'd cut too much.
Exactly. But at the same time, they still had all these redundancies in areas like HR and IT. So it was just a really clear example of how a non-strategic approach to cost-cutting can completely backfire.
Right, so you end up hurting yourself in the long run. So how does McKinsey recommend that businesses approach this more strategically?
Well, they lay out 3 key areas where companies can really unlock significant value. The first is what they call restructuring to reflect your future.
Okay, that sounds pretty big picture. What does that actually entail?
It's about taking a really hard look at your core business model, asking yourself some tough questions. Like, are you operating in the right markets? Is your organizational structure truly aligned with your strategic goals? Are there any unresolved issues from past mergers or acquisitions that are weighing you down?
So it's not just about fixing the inefficiencies you had right now.
It's about being proactive and anticipating how the market is going to evolve and then building a cost structure that's going to set you up for success in the future.
Even that means making some difficult decisions in the short term.
Absolutely. You have to be willing to adapt, and sometimes that means letting go of things that might have worked in the past but are no longer serving you.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second area where McKinsey sees a lot of potential?
The second area is what they call cutting the fat. And this is where some of those more traditional efficiency measures come into play.
Okay, so this is about streamlining things, getting leaner.
Exactly. It's about things like trimming down those management layers, eliminating redundant roles or processes, applying those lean management principles to every aspect of your operations.
And really taking a hard look at that corporate center, right? Seeing if there are ways to operate more efficiently at that level.
Right. It's all about maximizing productivity and eliminating any unnecessary overhead.
Okay, I'm following. So what's the third area? The third source of value they identify?
The third area is focused on building capabilities. And what McKinsey points out is that a lot of times those cost problems that we see, they're actually just symptoms of deeper organizational weaknesses.
Okay, so you're saying that sometimes the way a company is structured or the way it operates is actually creating those cost issues.
Exactly. Things like excessive complexity, having people in roles that don't really play to their strengths, having ineffective performance management systems, or even leaders who are constantly bogged down in low-value tasks.
So if you address those root causes, you can actually drive down costs in the long run.
Right, because you're making the whole organization more efficient and more effective. And McKinsey actually provides a really compelling example of this in action. They talk about this government-funded environmental organization. And instead of spreading their resources thinly across all these different species-specific lobbying efforts, they made a strategic decision to reallocate a significant portion of their budget to focus specifically on climate change.
Because they identified that as the area with the greatest potential impact.
Exactly. They realized that by focusing their resources on that one key area, they could actually achieve a much greater overall impact. And it's a great example of how a cost-conscious decision can actually become a catalyst for greater strategic success.
That's a really powerful example. It shows that sometimes less is more, as long as you're being strategic about it.
Exactly. Now, another really significant theme that emerges from our research, especially from McKinsey, is the incredible potential of technology to really transform cost reduction efforts. And they focus specifically on those general and administrative expenses, those G&A costs, things like finance, procurement, HR, IT.
Right. So this is about using tech to streamline those back office functions, the things that aren't always directly visible to customers, but are essential to running the business.
Precisely. And McKinsey's research actually shows that these G&A costs have been rising faster than revenue for a lot of companies. So it's a really important area to focus on.
Okay, so let's dig into this. How exactly can technology make such a big difference when it comes to reducing these indirect costs?
Well, McKinsey lays out a really clear 4-stage approach. It starts with identify areas for improvement. And this is where things like big data, artificial intelligence, those advanced analytics, and process mining really come into play.
Okay, so a lot of buzzwords there. Can you break that down for our listeners a little bit?
Sure. So imagine process mining as a sort of digital X-ray of your workflows. It shows you exactly where those bottlenecks and inefficiencies are hiding within the systems you're already using.
Oh, so it helps you get a really granular view of where things are getting stuck.
Exactly. And these tools allow you to really pinpoint those opportunities for optimization, whether it's in your finance department, in your procurement processes, even in your HR systems. And McKinsey points out that there's a huge potential for improvement here, especially in finance. They say that about 75% of those revenue management processes are fully automatable, but only about 10% of financial planning and analysis is actually being done that way.
So there's a big gap there, a lot of room to do things more efficiently.
Right. Now, once you've identified those areas where you can make improvements, the second stage is automate processes.
So this is where you start actually implementing some of those technological solutions.
Exactly. This stage is about bringing in those quick win technologies like robotic process automation, RPA. You've probably heard of that.
Yeah, RPA is becoming really popular.
And it's for good reason. It can take over those repetitive manual tasks that take up so much time and are prone to human error.
Right, so things like data entry, invoice processing, those kinds of things.
Exactly. And by automating those tasks, you're freeing up your human employees to focus on those more strategic, more creative tasks that require that human touch.
Okay, so it's not about replacing people, it's about making them more efficient.
Right. It's about leveraging technology to really empower your workforce. Now, the third stage in McKinsey's approach is called work smarter.
So this is about going beyond just automating those simple tasks.
Exactly. This stage is all about harnessing those more advanced capabilities of AI and machine learning.
Okay, so we're talking about things like predictive analytics, decision support systems, things like that.
Precisely. It's about using these technologies to not just automate those routine tasks, but to actually start making better decisions, more informed decisions, faster.
So it's about giving your teams the tools they need to make better use of the data they have.
Exactly. And to gain those deeper, more actionable insights that can really drive performance improvements.
Okay, I'm following. So what's the final stage in this tech-enabled approach to cost reduction?
The final stage is capture impact. And this is all about making sure you're actually tracking the results of your efforts.
So it's not enough to just implement the technology. You have to measure whether it's actually working.
Right. You have to be able to see those concrete benefits, to see that return on your investment. And McKinsey recommends setting up a center of competence, or a COC, to manage this process.
So that you can continuously monitor your progress and make adjustments as needed.
Exactly. It's about creating a sustainable system for optimizing your costs over the long term. And McKinsey actually provided some really great real-world examples of companies that have used this approach to achieve some pretty impressive results.
Yeah, can you share a couple of those? I think our listeners would be really interested to hear how this actually plays out in practice.
Sure. One example is a medical technology company that used data visualization and AI to really take a deep dive into their procurement processes.
So this is like that digital X-ray you were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And by doing this, they were able to identify all these price variances across their different suppliers. And just by addressing those discrepancies, they were able to achieve savings of between 5 and 10%.
Wow, so just by getting a clearer picture of their spending, they were able to find significant savings.
Right. Another great example is an international company that used process mining within their finance department to identify those bottlenecks in their invoicing system.
So this is about finding those points where things were getting slowed down.
Exactly. And by streamlining that process, they were able to significantly reduce their invoicing time, which improved their overall order processing efficiency.
So it's not just about cost savings, it's also about improving those key operational metrics.
Exactly. It's about making the whole business run more smoothly. And we saw several other compelling examples as well, like an energy company that used analytics to identify price discrepancies for their MRO supplies, those maintenance, repair, and operations things. They were able to reduce their costs in that area by 5 to 15%.
That's pretty significant.
Yeah. And then there's a car maker that used data visualization in their production management to automate their reporting process. They cut their planning time by 30%. Just by doing that.
Wow, those are some really tangible results. It's really inspiring to see how companies are leveraging these technologies to drive real improvements.
Absolutely. And the examples just keep coming. There's a specialty steel maker that used RPA to automate those repetitive tasks in their production management and saw a significant reduction in errors and saved a ton of time. And then there's an automotive company that used RPA and machine learning in their production planning to automate their data transfer and speed up their forecasting. They actually achieved a payback period of just 1 year on that investment.
So they made back all the money they spent on implementing that technology within a year.
That's right. And then there's this global tech company that used AI in their finance department to optimize their accounts receivable. They actually reduced their outstanding balance by 7% and their collection costs by 15%.
That's really impressive. So we've seen how technology can be a game changer when it comes to reducing those broader operational costs. But what about IT spending specifically?
That's a great point. Gartner actually has a lot to say about that. They really emphasize the need for companies to establish a strategic cost optimization discipline within their IT function itself.
So it's not just about cutting the overall IT budget, it's about being smarter about how you allocate those resources within IT.
Exactly. It's about making sure that every dollar you spend on IT is actually delivering maximum value to the business. And Gartner lays out 3 key steps to achieve this.
Okay, let's hear them. What's the first step?
The first step is to really clearly establish why smart spending matters within the IT organization.
So this is about getting buy-in from the IT team.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture of financial responsibility within IT. And Gartner recommends doing things like sharing clear examples of both wasteful IT spending and successful optimization initiatives.
So that people can see the real-world impact of their decisions?
Right. And it's also about getting the IT team to think more broadly about the business impact of their spending.
So not just thinking about technology and oscillation, but thinking about how it contributes to the overall success of the company.
Exactly. And the second step that Gartner highlights is to identify and then operationalize those desired smart IT spending behaviors.
So this is about moving from theory to practice, actually changing the way people do things.
Right. It's about first defining those specific spending behaviors that you want to encourage. Then it's about getting individual team members to commit to those behaviors. And finally, it's about integrating those new habits into their everyday workflows and decision-making processes.
So it becomes just part of how they do their jobs.
Exactly. And the third step is focused on reinforcement, making sure those new behaviors stick.
So how do you do that?
It's about creating an environment where people feel comfortable talking about both their successes and the challenges they encounter when it comes to managing IT spending.
So open communication is key.
Right. And it's also about proactively addressing any knowledge gaps within the IT team. Maybe there are folks who need some additional training on financial management principles.
Yeah, it makes sense to give them the skills they need to be successful.
And then finally, it's about establishing regular rituals, like maybe monthly meetings where financial information is shared and discussed.
So that everyone stays informed and accountable.
Exactly. And Gartner also emphasizes the importance of ongoing scrutiny of IT spending. They say that mature IT organizations are constantly looking for ways to eliminate spending that's not delivering tangible business value.
So it's not just about cutting costs once, it's about continuously optimizing your IT spending.
Right. It's about being vigilant. And Gartner also stresses the importance of optimizing your existing IT spend. Maybe there are ways to reallocate resources from lower value projects to those that are more strategically important.
So it's about making sure your IT dollars are aligned with your business goals.
Exactly. And finally, they highlight the importance of ensuring that any new IT capabilities that you're funding are directly aligned with those business goals.
So there needs to be a strong partnership between IT and the rest of the business.
Absolutely. IT shouldn't be seen as this separate entity. They need to be working hand in hand with business leaders to make sure that those technology investments are truly driving the business forward.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about identifying those areas where you can reduce costs, and we've talked about optimizing your spending. But how do you actually make those cost-cutting efforts stick? How do you prevent those costs from creeping back up over time?
That's a really important question. And McKinsey has actually done a lot of research on this. They found that many companies struggle to sustain those cost reductions over the long term.
So they make these big cuts, and then a year or two later, they're right back where they started.
Exactly. And McKinsey outlines 5 key things that CFOs can do to prevent this from happening. The first is to assign accountability for cost management at the right level within the organization.
So it's about making sure that the people who are responsible for managing those costs are actually the ones who have the power to control them.
Exactly. You need to break down those cost targets to specific business units, to specific roles. McKinsey gives the example of a high-tech company that actually completely restructured their reporting lines to achieve this. They realized that the people who were best equipped to manage those costs weren't necessarily the ones who had been traditionally responsible for them.
So it might require some organizational changes to get this right.
It might, but it's really important to make sure that those cost management responsibilities are aligned with the actual decision-making authority.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second way to make those cuts stick?
The second way is to focus not just on how much you're going to cut, but on how you're actually going to achieve those cuts.
So it's about having a plan, not just a target.
Exactly. It's about establishing new policies, implementing new procedures, and maybe most importantly, it's about having those senior leaders in the organization really model those cost-conscious behaviors.
So it's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Right. And benchmarking can be really helpful here too. Both internal benchmarking, looking at your own historical data, and external benchmarking, comparing yourself to your peers.
So you can see where you stand and where there might be opportunities for improvement.
Exactly. McKinsey gives the example of a capital goods manufacturer that used external benchmarking to identify some really significant savings in their travel expenses.
Just by comparing themselves to other companies in their industry?
That's right. They realized that they were spending way more on travel than their competitors, and they were able to make some changes to bring their spending more in line.
Okay, that's a great example of how benchmarking can be really powerful. What's the third point that McKinsey makes?
The third point is to make sure that you're not letting that high-level P&L accounting data obscure the underlying cost issues.
So this is about digging deeper, not just looking at the surface.
Exactly. It's about looking at the detailed transactional data to identify those areas of underperformance that might not be obvious from those summary financial statements.
So it's about getting granular.
Right. And transparency in that detailed data can be really important too.
Yeah.
Sometimes there are disagreements within an organization about where those cost problems actually lie.
So having that data can help to resolve those disputes and get everyone on the same page.
Exactly. And the fourth way to ensure that those cost reductions are sustainable is to really clearly articulate the link between cost management and the overall business strategy.
So this is about making sure that those cost-cutting efforts are aligned with the bigger picture.
Right. Cost cutting should never be seen as this isolated exercise. It needs to be driven by and directly support the company's strategic objectives.
So you need to understand how those cost reductions are going to help the company achieve its goals.
Exactly. And McKinsey uses the example of a low-tech medical device company that made some really targeted cuts to their manufacturing operations. But they did this based on a clear understanding of their return on invested capital, their ROIC, and their market growth potential.
So they weren't just cutting blindly, they were making strategic decisions about where to allocate their resources.
Exactly. And finally, McKinsey emphasizes that cost management needs to become an ongoing competency within the organization.
So it's not just a one-time thing, it's a way of life.
Right. It needs to be embedded in the company culture, in the standard operating procedures.
So it becomes just part of how the business is run.
Exactly. Now, for those businesses that are focused on producing physical products, manufacturing, and materials, obviously represent a huge chunk of their operational costs. And BCG has some really valuable insights into how to optimize those specific areas.
Okay, so let's talk about manufacturing. Where does BCG recommend that companies start?
They start with a really thorough review of all of their manufacturing operations, and they break this down by individual cost categories. So they're really getting into the nitty-gritty, looking at every single expense.
So they're creating a detailed map of their cost structure.
Exactly. And then they use that map to prioritize those cost reduction actions based on the company's overall business strategy.
So they're not just looking for ways to cut costs, they're looking for ways to cut costs that will actually support the business's goals.
Right. And when it comes to addressing those variable manufacturing costs, those costs that fluctuate with the volume of production, BCG highlights a couple of key strategies.
Like what?
Well, one is strategic automation. But they really emphasize that automation should only be pursued if there's a clear and justifiable return on investment.
So you don't just automate for the sake of automating, you have to make sure it makes financial sense.
Exactly. And the other key strategy is implementing those lean process improvements. Things like eliminating waste, improving workflow, those kinds of things.
So it's about making the entire manufacturing process more efficient.
Right. And these improvements can not only reduce costs, they can also potentially allow you to reallocate your staff to those higher value activities.
So it's a win-win. You're saving money and you're empowering your employees to do more meaningful work.
Exactly. Now, BCG also acknowledges that there are often some pretty significant roadblocks that can hinder those cost transformation efforts within manufacturing.
Like what? What are some of the common challenges?
Well, one is just a lack of experience. Some companies just haven't done a lot of this kind of work before, so they don't have the internal expertise to really drive those changes effectively.
Yeah, it can be daunting if you've never done it before.
Right. And another common challenge is having an unclear or poorly communicated strategic vision.
So people don't really understand why they're being asked to make these changes.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the inherent complexity of those manufacturing processes. There are a lot of moving parts. It can be hard to know where to start.
And I imagine data can be a big challenge, too.
Absolutely. A lot of manufacturing companies are still struggling with a lack of digitization, where they have all these siloed systems where the data is not easily accessible or shareable.
So it's hard to get a clear picture of what's really going on.
Right. And BCG offers some really great recommendations for overcoming these challenges.
Like what? How can companies improve their chances of success?
Well, first and foremost, they need to clearly define those project requirements and objectives. Everyone needs to be on the same page about what they're trying to achieve.
So clear communication is key.
Absolutely. And then they need to develop those detailed implementation plans. You can't just wing it. You need to have a roadmap.
So it's about having a structured approach.
Right. And then, of course, they need to make sure that they're allocating adequate resources to those initiatives. You can't expect people to make these changes without giving them the time, the tools, and the support they need.
Right. You have to invest in success.
Exactly. And then it's also important to establish those robust performance metrics so you can track your progress and make sure you're actually achieving those desired results.
So you can measure whether those cost reductions are actually sticking.
Right. And BCG also stresses the importance of incorporating those change management strategies to address any resistance to those changes. Because change can be difficult, and people are often resistant to it.
So you need to help people understand why those changes are necessary and how they're going to benefit from them.
Exactly. And then finally, BCG recommends bringing in those external experts, those consultants who have specific experience in manufacturing cost optimization when needed.
So don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it.
Exactly. Sometimes it's just more efficient to bring in someone who's done this before and can guide you through the process.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here today, but there's one more topic I want to touch on before we wrap up, and that's the role of strategic partnerships in cost reduction.
Oh, that's a really interesting area, and Deloitte has some great insights on this. They're seeing a real shift happening right now.
In what way?
Well, in the past, outsourcing was really just about taking those non-core functions and finding someone else to do them cheaper.
So it was all about cost arbitrage.
Exactly. But what we're seeing now is a move towards much more strategic partnerships, even in those core areas of the business.
So companies are partnering with other companies to achieve strategic goals, not just to save money.
Exactly. And the primary focus of these partnerships is on driving transformation, fostering innovation, really pushing the business forward. It's not just about getting mess for less anymore.
So it's about finding partners who can bring unique expertise or capabilities to the table.
Exactly. And Deloitte highlights some interesting examples of this in the retail sector. Like some retailers are now outsourcing their entire space management and planogram creation.
So they're letting someone else decide how to lay out their stores and display their products?
That's right. They're recognizing that other companies might have more expertise in this area, and they can do it more efficiently. And we're even seeing competing mall operators collaborating on things like centralized curbside pickup services.
So they're working together to improve the customer experience.
Exactly. And by pooling their resources, they can do it more efficiently. And we're also seeing more companies using those external risk management platforms for things like data privacy and cybersecurity.
So they're turning those fixed costs into more flexible variable expenses.
Right. And all of these examples really show how strategic partnerships can be so much more than just a way to cut costs. They can be a powerful tool for driving innovation, for improving the customer experience, and for making the entire business more agile and resilient.
So, to sum it all up, we've explored a wide range of strategies for businesses to reduce their operational costs effectively.
We started by talking about that crucial shift from across-the-board cutting to that more strategic approach, to focusing on cost optimization and understanding where your core value truly lies.
And then we talked about the power of targeted restructuring, about streamlining your organization to really make sure that it's aligned with your strategic goals.
And we talked about the incredible impact that technology can have, particularly those technologies like AI and automation that can help you rapidly reduce those costs in those G&A functions, those back office functions that are often overlooked.
And then we delved into the importance of establishing that smart IT spending discipline, making sure that you're not just cutting IT budgets, but that you're really optimizing those investments, that you're making sure that every dollar you spend is driving real business value.
And then we discussed those critical factors in making those cost cuts stick for the long term. Focusing on accountability, aligning those cost management efforts with your overall business strategy, and really making it an ongoing part of your organizational culture.
And for those product-based businesses, we looked at those specific strategies for optimizing those manufacturing costs through automation and those lean process improvements.
And finally, we highlighted that evolving role of strategic partnerships. How companies are moving beyond just outsourcing for cost arbitrage and are really forming these strategic alliances to drive transformation and innovation.
Right. And the key takeaway here is that truly effective operational cost reduction is not just about saving money in the short term. It's about strategically reinvesting those freed up resources to fuel future growth.
It's about building stronger organizational capabilities. It's about creating a more competitive, more innovative, and ultimately a more resilient business for the long haul.
So as you reflect on everything we've discussed today, I want you to consider this. What's one area within your own operations where you could make that shift from traditional cost cutting to a more strategic optimization mindset? What's one area where that shift could potentially unlock the most significant and sustainable benefits for your business? And what specific technological advancements might offer the most impactful opportunities for efficiency gains in your unique context? I really encourage you to revisit those real-world examples that we shared and those strategic frameworks that we discussed today to really pinpoint those actionable insights that can truly propel your business forward.
It's been a great discussion, and I think there's a lot for our listeners to take away and apply to their own businesses.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to ProcessCast. This episode was brought to you by HEFLO, the BPM platform that empowers businesses to document, automate, and optimize their processes with AI. Experience the intelligence to simplify complex business processes and accelerate your growth with our complete management solution. Visit heflo.com to learn more. Be sure to follow ProcessCast for more insights on business process management, and don't forget to share this episode with your network. Until next time.